tell me what motivated you to start the Bipartisan Policy Center?
Well, I'm a middle child, honestly. I think if I really want to go back to basics, I think I've always been doing this work. I just wasn't getting paid for it for a long time. I mean, look, a couple of things happened. Your life is a series of coincidences. One thing that I did in college was something that I know you are also fond of, was extemporaneous debate.
That's right.
And the beauty of that is recognizing that there's always a different point of view that you can actually embody yourself if forced to. And that, you know, if one idea is going this way, you don't actually have to come right at it. There's just always kind of a different place to land. I think I remember Howard Baker, who was one of our co-founders, said, you know, that he'd met a lot of people in the world who were 80% wrong, which is really, really, really wrong. But he'd never met anybody who was 100% wrong. And, you know, so looking for those little kind of embers was part of what I think happened. And then I just stumbled into a job working for the Northeast Governors when they just happened to be a bipartisan group back in the late 80s, early 90s, working on energy and air quality issues. And so kind of recognized that there is a certain exhilaration and power in collaboration, which was something that a lot of people don't see.
And how has that remained constant or not over your time in leadership?
So it's actually been much more consistent than I think most people imagine. And you know, I think if you look at, well, maybe just point out two things. So this last year, despite how incredibly toxic and Marjorie Taylor Greene and I mean, it was probably the most productive legislative year in the last decade. And it was also oddly the most bipartisan year, in that you had this reconciliation process, which is by definition designed to be partisan. One team plays by itself. And at the same time, they passed a couple of dozen pretty significant pieces of bipartisan legislation. And it was the infrastructure bill and the CHIPS Act, US and China, the PACT Act, which protects veterans, things that sound boring like postal reform, but it actually matters if you like to get mail. The gun bill, the Violence Against Women's Act, the Respect for Marriage Act, they passed all these laws. And if you're going to be optimistic about it, you will say that they rediscovered this capacity to kind of metabolize the aggression that is inherent in any free pluralistic democracy and fight sometimes and work together other times. If you're less optimistic, the Republicans just never thought the Democrats could get the reconciliation thing passed, so they were willing to collaborate a little bit along the way. And then, look, the other thing that you can't help but note is this election. So for about 15 years, I've been talking about this fundamental ballast, this kind of superpower in American democracy, which, when we get really close to the edge, that it would kind of pull us back. And since you're an academic, I will, note Tocqueville described it as repairable mistakes, right? Not that we were prettier or smarter or better, but that this country, this culture had this capacity to make repairable mistakes. And in the last few years, I talked about it a lot more with great vigor while I started to believe it less and less. And this election was a pretty great thing, because at least it's an ember that suggests that, like when it gets really scary, maybe there is that kind of just core premise. I think we were afraid that there'd be 100 people challenging election results, that the basic fabric of that democracy could just be really cast into doubt. And it just didn't happen. I mean, election denial, it's a crappy political argument, right? Like, people got stuck doing it, but you're gonna run for office. Jobs, the economy, education. No one's like, focus on the polling process, right? So it was a bad argument, and they didn't believe it. And the magic of that, I don't know if we did this, but I'd asked my comms team to do they gave incredibly gracious speeches acknowledging their loss. And even some of the folks who were just kind of terrible did this very traditional, I called my opponent and I gave them the best of luck. So those two things make me feel like there is a through line that we can't take for granted. We need those 44 million, it's got to be constantly served and engaged, but I think we got to hope.
So I know you're aware, but for those of you in the audience, there was a major report that came out in, I think it was 2018, 2019 by More in Common, that identified that, roughly speaking, 65 to 70% of our country was what was then defined as the exhausted majority. That is, that group of people who actually did want to see work happening across whatever spans there were, and wanted to just get things done. That I think research made many of us optimistic in many of the different ways we've been talking about where this country is. Do you see that group as a constituency? Does that ever coalesce in any way or form that you see?
Not so much, right? Because I think we see people answer those polling questions, and then we'll ask other questions. What do you think about a Democratic plan to do blank? And it will be dramatically supported by Democrats and opposed by Republicans. And then you just say, what do you think about a Republican plan to do the exact same thing? And it just flips, right? So I think we want our better angels, but when it comes to actually putting the work in to choose them, it's not easy. But there's another theory of the case. I mentioned that there were about 20 major bipartisan activities in this last 2 years. What's more interesting than the number 20 is that 70 members of the US Senate played a leading role in one or more of those initiatives. And we have a pretty high bar for a leading role. So they were part of the original gang, right? The group that came together and took the political heat to say, we can put a deal together. They were an original co-sponsor of the legislation, or they were the chair or ranking member of the committee that passed the bipartisan bill. There are not 70 constructive moderates in the United States Senate. And we have seen this graphic which shows that the parties have no ideological overlap anymore, which people misconstrue to say they can't do anything. But we are more complicated than our ideological mean. And so if you do the work, you can find partisans who are willing to work together. And I actually think that is a more realistic story going forward than imagining that there's this moderate base that's going to find itself in a political space. Now, the other reason is the political space doesn't encourage that to happen, which we could talk about, but some systems change would help that along.
The BPPC says that it prioritizes one thing above all others, which is getting things done. What are the next things that are going to get done?
So we like to say we have the fierce urgency of pragmatism as a kind of guiding principle, that most revolutions, if you look at them carefully, were evolutions that just took a little while. So next, I mean, the things that can get done in this Congress, and then maybe a little more broadly, I think in this coming Congress, you are going to see a lot more focus on workforce and this question of particularly why are women not moving into the workforce in the same numbers that has been the case. And that is going to bring back questions that were substantively supported by both parties until reconciliation polarized them. So issues like paid family leave, which again had a strong bipartisan basis, childcare. And one of the challenges of the reconciliation process was a lot of the issues were good issues, but then they got basically painted as one side versus the other. There is going to be a lot of focus on spending the couple $1 trillion that your children all just paid for. So we wrote some really big checks, and that is part of the reason why inflation is so high, right? There's some dumb money floating around there. But there's an incredible imperative for the government now to implement these things. And you look at the transportation bill, tremendous amount of kind of transitional money to accelerate the climate clean energy revolution. Our government's not good at doing big things fast, particularly when one side is looking for them to trip and stumble. And so I think there's going to be a lot of focus on, in the next Congress, how we can actually execute on some of those pretty big commitments.
One of the great things about our country is the federalism. And so we've been talking a lot about what happens here in town. Tell me, what do you see at the state level? How is bipartisan work happening there or not?
So, I mean, the closer you get to ground, the more practical people are, right? So I think it's always been this case that you look at, county executives and mayors, and I think, we found that you see a lot more kind of collaboration out of necessity. The states are turning more like the federal government, right? I mean, we have definitely seen the trickle down of tribalism. But look, places where there's a lot of interesting work going on. I think one is, you look at what's happened in the elections. So good news, this last election was not tragic. Don't exhale. The most significant 6 months that will dictate the rules of the 2024 election are the first 6 months of next year. That's when the states rejigger all their stuff. And you're gonna see, this is, you were asking about productive stuff, you're gonna see some really wackadoodle laws, like states trying to say, we will no longer use machines to count ballots. The reason we invented machines pretty much was to count things. Like machines are really, really good at that. And so, there's just gonna be a whole lot of that I think people are focused on, have to take care of. And I think you're also seeing states start to focus more and more on issues that are, just you can't not see them every day. So the opioid crisis, that kind of got way worse during the pandemic, but nobody noticed. The housing crisis, this is not a part, you have homelessness in rural and urban areas alike. So I think you're starting to see some of those fraying of just basic human needs that I think you'll get some progress on.
Last question. You said that democracy is badly bruised but not broken.
Mm-hmm.
What gives you optimism about democracy right now?
Well, so look, I'll come at it from two places. Right? One is where you are. We are also doing work with citizens and scholars looking at issues around free expression on campus. And people are pretty courageous. I mean, it is not an easy thing. I have a sophomore in college, and she will affirm that you put yourself in some kind of personal jeopardy if you express an opinion that is not seen as being kind of consistent with mostly the kind of woke expectations. But people are fighting that, right? Like, it's not, that while we see it as a wave, it's not something that people are tolerating. And we are also working, I would say it is probably the most significant issue next to just economic survival on the minds of most college presidents. And so I think that the fact that the generally liberal academy is fighting like hell not to lose the capacity for diversity and engagement across difference and recognize that inclusion and freedom are not at odds. Like that, we're pushing back, right? So I think that matters. And look, and then I'll just kind of, maybe close where we started. You might not like the judges that get picked, but the courts are working. And Congress, it's not fun to watch so much. I mean, part of the reason it's not working so well is we're watching too much, but that's a different story. They're continuing to get quite a bit done. I think the executive branch is, again, it's doing pretty well. I mean, it's big and it's clunky and they have meetings about setting up meetings, but and so like the elections was that's the Achilles heel, right? That's the place where, as my elections guy likes to say, the Constitution gives people legitimate power to do illegitimate things. It just wasn't designed for the loss of norm. And so I think that's where we're probably most hopeful, that system seems to be restoring itself.
Like that. So those of you who know me know that I lived in DC for 25 years and then moved to Maine in very early 2019. I now live in a town of 8,000 people, about a half hour north of Portland. We live in a town that is incredibly economically diverse. On one end are mansions on the water, professionals and so on. On the other end are kind of housing subsidized and so on and so forth, and incredibly ideologically diverse. Yet, because we're a communitarian place, we actually all have to come together to vote on our budget and pass it, which is just one of the most amazing experiences, to all go to the Elks Lodge and literally through a raising of hands, pass the budget, and then also know that because there's only one middle school and one high school in your town, that neighbor of yours who lives 3 doors down, who has a sign, who did not vote for the same president, who did not vote for the same senator, we're standing next to each other rooting for our kids' volleyball team every week. And it just reminds you, kind of to your point, of maybe we're looking too often and too much at Congress and not enough about our communities and the things that we can do. And that gives me optimism.